But yeah, let's talk about this scenario we have for today, because I think it really ties into this, and then we can sort of talk about it. But this one says, budgeting helped me until it started making me miserable. I started budgeting to feel more in control, and for a while, it actually worked. Tracking everything, labeling every expense, cutting back. I felt proud of how disciplined I was, but now it feels like I can't enjoy anything unless it's free. I'll stare at something I want, like a coffee or a cab ride or a book, and talk myself out of it over and over. Not because I can't afford it, but because it's not justified in my spreadsheet. Every little purchase feels like a failure, and even when I do spend, I don't feel happy. I feel guilty, like I broke a rule. It's like I stopped budgeting for peace of mind and started budgeting to punish myself. I'm not sure where the line is between being careful and being obsessive, but I think I crossed it. I think
this one really hits home. Yeah, this one really hits home for me when they said that like a coffee or a cab ride, like things that they want but they just don't feel like they can afford. Because my wife will always deny getting an Uber. She's like, I hate taking it, and she always like disguises it as like, oh, just like you have to make awkward conversation or blah blah blah. Yeah. She hates paying for Ubers, and she thinks we just can't afford it. She thinks it's a silly way to spend money that you pay for some. I'm like, I'd rather we both can go out and drink, and then we just take an Uber both ways. But I see what this person. This is kind of like the sometimes when I think about it, it's like if you've lived your life all the way over here one way and it's put you in a bad financial situation, sometimes you need to flip the script completely and go lean all the way the other way, the opposite direction.
Yep.
And so if your life was very unstructured, there was no control over the spending, I think it's helpful if you flip it all the way around. There's a ton of structure, a ton of control with how you spend your money, and then you start to balance out towards the middle as you build those habits. I think this person, they flipped the script all the way to one side. They started doing all the right things, but they never course corrected, or they never adjusted those habits now to be somewhere in the middle. I think for a time being, there should be a lot of like rigid structure with how you run your finances if you want to get out of a bad financial situation and you want to get out of it quickly, right? That's what I think you need, but that's not a sustainable way to live your life. And I do think you need to come back a little bit towards the middle where there is flexibility. There's room for you to spend money on things that aren't necessarily justified, but you can afford it.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because this reminds me of sort of my situation. I wonder if she had a goal at first, like that's why she started budgeting. So for my example, would have been me paying off my debt. So I was very rigid about everything. So everything did have a purpose as it was coming in and out of my budget. Wondering if that's what happened here, because after my debt-free journey was over, or the goal maybe this person completed, it can feel a little bit like, okay, well now that's completed. And now it's like, well, if I do go outside of those boundaries, like I've made a big mistake, or I'm going to ruin this or that, because for so long you just felt like, that this is where I had to stay in, like in the lines right here, because it was a little bit difficult for me because I had cut everything out of my budget essentially to get that debt paid off. So when I was done with that, it was a little bit weird to switch back. So because you're just so strict for a while. So I would assume that's potentially what happened here. Maybe she started building up an emergency fund or paid off a debt or something like that. And now it just feels a little out of control. But we really just have to go back to the basics. Like budgeting is literally just telling you where you can spend your money, and just make yourself a little, I have one in my budget spreadsheet, a miscellaneous fund, and it's pretty wild. It has random things in there. I don't have a reason where I have to go down to the nitty gritty for each individual category. I just have a miscellaneous fund. And guess what? If I stay within those boundaries, whatever can go in that. Sometimes I have to rein it back because I'm like, all right, I don't really need to be spending all this money on miscellaneous stuff. Yeah. Like, let's just remember what it's all about and don't overcomplicate, because I think that's what's happening here.
Lauren, I'm very nitty gritty with all my stuff. I've tried to back off a little bit. So now I have a buffer category, which covers a lot of stuff. And then instead of all right, this is our dining out fund and this is our entertainment, these are our subscriptions. Yeah. I've just grouped it all together as fun money. Oh. And so now I just have one category for fun money, and it covers a whole bunch of things. It's given me a little bit more peace of mind, because now I'm it's just fun stuff. I don't have to worry about how, what little category it goes to, and then making those adjustments in your mind of I could pull from this one to add more to this one, Now it's all just fun money. So I will say, going more towards the middle if you're in a good financial situation, being more in the middle, more of the flexibility is definitely helpful. But, something you said, I'm curious, so you went from being crazy in debt, right? Mm-hmm. Also having a limited income, to now completely debt free. I think you talked about it. You know, your income has gone up substantially since then. Like,
Yeah.
what are there periods now, even still now, where you're like, man, I can't even think about how I spend money now versus back then? Like, does that still, like, I don't know, almost blow your mind a little bit to think like the way you spend your money now, you probably couldn't have even imagined when you were trying to pay off debt because everything was going towards the debt?
Yeah, and like you said, making so much more now. Like I had so much little to or so much less to work with back then, and now I'm not even in debt, and I have a lot more to work with. So yeah, it's quite different between the two. Now I feel like I'm mostly focused on like building up my investments and things like that. So that's where my money has been going. But yeah, obviously I'm a little more relaxed on that front.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, so for this person, like being miserable with when you budget, I think you'd kind of alluded to it. This person like probably just needs to set a new goal, or they need to recognize like what season of life they're in now.
Yeah.
They probably had a very strict and disciplined budget for a specific goal. And now it's just about how do we turn it around? How do we course correct? I always like to say course correct, because now what is the goal, right? If the goal is now to just enjoy life while you continue to build your investments and you maintain a strong savings, then that can be reflected in the budget. Like I'm always a big believer that how you spend your money, and in other words, like what your budget looks like, that's going to be a reflection of what your priorities are. And so ask yourself at this point in time, what are your priorities? And then does my budget reflect that? You know, like is your priority really to spend nothing on enjoying life right now after you've worked so hard to maybe get out of debt or build up your savings or whatever it is? You know, like if your real time spending versus your priorities, if those two things don't align, like something has to change.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe she's overcomplicating this because she was tracking everything, labeling every expense. I feel like maybe for this person, even just taking a step back and making some broader categories of, like you said, now you just have like a fun money category. Probably someone like this would probably benefit from that, just to have a little bit more, freedom to how they're spending their money. But and something that this person said was, now it feels like I can't enjoy anything unless it's free. Like, budgeting does not mean cheap. Like we need to like, I wish we could like just honestly, don't use the word budgeting. Here's my spending plan. Here's my money map, whatever you want to call it. I think we just has this negative connotation around the word budgeting. And so it just feels like that does not mean cheap. Like I still like to go out to eat every month. We have a nice restaurant budget for that kind of thing. It doesn't mean I'm cheap. It just means I'm planning out so I know where my money's going to go. So for this person, I think they just need to back off a little bit from all the exact sort of expense tracking. That's great for a season, but I think right now they're in a spot where mentally it's a little bit too much for them. So maybe back off a little bit, create some broader categories, and just live your life and just know that you're going to be okay. This person's doing what they're supposed to do. Just relax a little bit.
Yeah. Lauren, I think you more so than me like to keep things simple. I know for me, like I like to be in the nitty gritty. Makes my mind feel at ease.
Yeah.
What would you say for someone like either they haven't gotten into budgeting yet, or even just someone like this who needs to find a looser way to budget? Like, what would you say is something that, like, how should people get started if they want like a lazy way to start budgeting, right? Like they're still taking control of their money, but they're not necessarily having too much control. And that sounds a little funny to say, but too much restriction rather, to where things are getting more complicated than they need to. Like how do people find that healthy balance when they're creating a budget?
Yeah, I think like I just mentioned, and I think this, when I was working with somebody in the past, they really did not like the very specific budgeting line items. Like they had to keep things broad. So I think it could be as simple as, if you're just starting this out, keep it as simple as putting your money at the top, like your income. What are you making each month? What's going out? So writing down all of your bills. What are those variable expenses that are coming out of like your restaurant budget or whatever? And then what are you doing? Any sort of debt payoff, any type of savings goals or anything? And you could just break it down into like those 5 main areas and just kind of keep it like that simple. You don't have to get into the nitty gritty of my car insurance, my car payment, my groceries, like whatever, just break it down into those bigger areas and then just lump it all together in there. So the one time like I said, I was working with a client before, and we actually would break it down by the week. So she knew exactly what her fun money was for the week. And that just really helped her be able to keep in check and not feel like she was either restricted or she just had like way too much freedom and didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So I think that, just keep it super simple. Just, obviously we want to know where your money's going. We want to know what's coming in, but keep it a little more simple for yourself and more broad, I guess, as far as like the different categories go.
Yeah, I think that's where it can start to feel overwhelming is when you try to break down everything too much. And I think there's a time and place for everything. You know, I think if someone really wants to get out of debt, for example, or they really want to build their savings, being like breaking things down to the nitty gritty, I think that can be helpful. But again, it's not something that you probably don't want to do that for years at a time, right? Unless your debt payoff journey is taking years, you know? With that said, I think the easiest way in my mind to explain budgeting is like, what needs to get paid? In other words, like your bills, your subscriptions, things like that. And then what's left over? And then can I just make a plan for what's left over? I think if you think about budgeting or your spending plan like that, I think that's how you can make it really, really simple, right? Like, and that's still going to take you knowing what your bills are, right? You got to know what your rent, your groceries, like that kind of stuff is. So you can kind of figure out, all right, of my income, you know, let's say I bring home $5,000 a month. Maybe I need like $3,500, $4,000 of that to go towards my bills. So I can kind of set that aside in my mind. Now I know I have 1,000 or 1,500. What's the plan for what's left over? I think that's an easier way to think about budgeting is like the stuff that has to get paid. And then how do I allocate what's left towards whatever my goal is? If that's paying off debt, if that's building my savings, if that's just enjoying life more, that's an easier way. I think people can kind of think about budgeting to where it's not so restrictive, or it's not so demanding is probably the word I'm looking for. It's not so demanding to create a budget if you go through it like that.
The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.